Some of us may have heard of the legendary and gruesome form of execution described in the Norse sagas as the blood eagle. If any of us have seen the show Vikings, you may remember the characters Jarl Borg and King Ayla being subjected to the horrific blood eagle ritual. The procedure is detailed in various sagas, and essentially it involves severing the victim's ribs from the spine and pulling their lungs through the opening to create a pair of so-called wings. As a medical doctor, I wanted to analyse the logistics of the blood eagle and look at whether this procedure could really be performed by any Viking with little practical understanding of underlying anatomy and lack of surgical training. So initially, after capturing the victim, they were often tied to a structure like a tree or a rock to prevent movement. The executioner would then firstly make a large incision along the victim's back. So anatomically, this incision would need to be near the midline and could potentially extend across the ribs. Making this sort of incision and cutting through layers of skin, muscle and connective tissue will cause a lot of bleeding without any sort of cauterization. So it's possible the victim could have gone into what we call hypovolemic shock due to large amounts of blood loss. This would quite quickly lead to reduced consciousness and eventually death. So let's say the victim is still somewhat conscious after this first step. Next, the executioner would move on to breaking the ribs. We know that ribs are a rigid structure, so separating or breaking them would require significant force. A fractured rib would again cause significant bleeding and exposure of the pleural cavity or the space around the lungs. If air leaks into this space, it will cause what we call a pneumothorax or collapsed lung, which will in turn lead to respiratory failure and death quite quickly. It would be a challenge as well for the executioner to achieve a clean break of the ribs without damaging surrounding structures like the lungs and the spinal cord. So now let's say we have a very skilled executioner who hasn't caused much damage to the adjacent structures, and the victim is still semi-conscious and managing to breathe to some extent. The next step would be lung displacement. So the lung would have to be carefully extracted, initially requiring the dissection of pleura, or the membrane covering the lungs. This would need to be dissected to free the organ. Now, any displacement or removal of lung membranes or lungs would cause immediate disruption of breathing, and scientifically I really can't see how any victim would still be alive in any shape or form after this stage. They would have died from asphyxiation and hypoxia or lack of oxygen before the full blood eagle was created. Another important consideration is the major blood vessels in the thoracic cavity, including the aorta, superior vena cava, pulmonary arteries and veins. If the executioner cut into these at any point, it would cause catastrophic blood loss and quite quickly lead to shock and death. So as we can see, the blood eagle procedure itself would have been extremely difficult to perform, and there are so many life-threatening complications to be considered at every stage. It is a procedure that would result in massive physical and psychological trauma, severe hemorrhage or blood loss, and asphyxiation. All of these complications would very quickly have led to death. I hope we can also appreciate that the executioner would have needed to have significant skill and strength to be able to carry out this ritual. Realistically, I cannot see any victim living through the whole of the blood eagle, and best case scenario, they may have lived to the point where the pleural membranes were dissected. In the sagas, the blood eagle was usually portrayed as the ultimate act of vengeance or punishment. This was usually for betrayal, and it was reserved for enemies who had committed deep wrongs, often against powerful Norse figures or their kin. There isn't actually any solid evidence that the blood eagle was ever actually practiced. Many historians argue that it was either a Christian misinterpretation or exaggeration of more ordinary Viking punishments, a poetic metaphor that got misread as literal, or even a symbolic narrative meant to amplify the fearsome reputation of Viking vengeance. So I hope you found this video interesting and informative. If you did, please do like, share and subscribe to my channel, Doctor of the Ages.